Greetings, Cap fans, and welcome to episode 47 of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast. I am your host, Rick Verbanis, and as always, I'm joined by the best gosh darn co-host out there, Mr. Bob Lucius. Or should I say, hello, Dr. Bob.
Dr. Bob. Do you remember, what was that? Mary Hartman? You don't remember that, right? There's a TV show, like a sitcom in the 70s. My sisters used to watch that. I don't know if I never watched that, but it was always on TV.
The only Dr. Bob I knew was Bob Newhart.
Bob Newhart. Yeah. There's another famous Dr. Bob.
Yeah. So, for those out there who don't know, Bob, we always talk about that Bob, was spent 25 years in the Marines and has served his country, but a lot of people don't know. Bob's a intellectual. Bob is a what is he? Are you like a professor?
Professor, yeah, indubitably, yes.
Yes. At a college in Florida, and he has his PhD. This week's greeting is hello, Dr. Bob. And why? Why, you may ask, am I referring to him as Dr. Bob? That's because in honor of today's guest, which is Dr. J. Richard Stevens. So looking forward to talking to him in a little bit. So Bob, how you been? How's the week going?
Good, man. Good. I mean, considering I'm still vertical, man. I mean, that's a good thing, right?
Every day above ground, right?
Every day above ground. I got a card one year. I think it was a Christmas card from my mom, who was having some health issues. Wasn't all quite there, but she wrote in the card, "Thank God I'm still vertical." So I always keep that in mind, right? You gotta.
Very nice. It's a good attitude to have.
Look on the bright side, right? Look on the bright side. So
yes. And that's a good segue, Bob. I think having a positive attitude in life is very, very important. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. I practice gratitude on a daily basis. I know that I'm very, very blessed in many things. Try not to sweat the small stuff. But the other thing too, Bob, as far as a positive attitude is concerned, I think that's one of the things that appeals to me so much about our favorite character, Captain America, specifically Mr. Steve Rogers. And I know there's been times where we have referenced, what would Cap do?
Mm-hmm. Right? No. And I'm glad you bring this up, Rick, because, there have been times in Cap's life where he has been down in the dumps, right? But he manages to find a way to pull himself back up by his bootstraps and get moving again. And I think that's a testament to the character, because we all have moments like that in our lives, But he sets a good example for how we can keep going, keep moving forward, never give up, never surrender.
Yeah, he has so many positive attributes that we appreciate and look up to. And hey. We've announced this on our Facebook group, the Captain America Comic Book Fans Facebook group, and I think it's time to announce it here on the podcast. We teased about this a little while, that we've got this premium that we want to have to give out as a thank you to our patrons, for those who contribute to the group, and you can do so as well. We have. I guess there's 3 different levels, right? I mean, there's like 99 cents a month. I think, what do we call that? We call that the Bucky, right? Right? That's the marketing guy, Bob.
There you go. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and if you want to do that, hey, thank you. And as a way of saying thank you, we have a few different things that we want to give to you. Okay. So for the 99 cents, the Bucky level, Bob, they get a couple things. One, they're going to get automatically entered into any of our contests. And number 2, you're going to be automatically pre-approved for any posts in the Facebook group. So no need to wait to have your posts approved. And so that's the first level. Second level, which is $4.99 a month, which, let's face it, it's the price of a comic book, right? So at that level, we're calling that our shield slinger, Bob. Our shield slinger level. What you get for that, you get the opportunity to, one, automatically know ahead of time who our guests are going to be. And you're also able to ask a question that we may use in the podcast to ask our guests the question. So you get that. And then, Bob, this is what I'm excited about. And this is probably why we're calling it the Shield Slinger. We have this really cool premium that we created, that it's a challenge coin. And Bob, do you want to explain to the listeners what a challenge coin is for those who aren't familiar?
Sure, Rick. I mean, I think for anybody who has maybe served in the military or in fire departments or even in police departments, and where these sorts of these items have become real popular in recent years, they're essentially sort of heavy coins, and usually made out of bronze or something, and they're designed to represent either the organization that you belong to or the leader of that organization, and you carry them in your pocket. And the challenge is, if you go into if you're in a bar, because guys in the military and police and fire apparently spend a lot of time in bars. Somebody pulls out a challenge coin, they challenge you, and if you're not carrying a coin, doesn't have to be the same coin, but it has to be a coin, then you got to buy the round of drinks. So it behooves you to have your coin on you at all times.
Right. Well, so we created this challenge coin, and so the idea behind the challenge coin is sort of like a reminder, right? So on one side, the characteristics say courage, integrity, compassion, sacrifice. On the other side, they say humility, empathy, honesty, perseverance. And in the center on the other side, you know what it says, Bob? What would Cap do? And so this is a really nice coin. It's like an inch and a half. It's heavy. It's got full color on both sides, and they weren't cheap, but we didn't want to spare any expense in creating these because we wanted to give something back to our patrons. So if you are in the Shield Slinger category, which is only $4.99 a month, you get and you've been in it for 3 months, you'll get this Captain America What Would Cap Do challenge coin, and as well get to find out who our guests are and submit a question. And then you might say, well, Rick, what's the next level, right? So the next level, which is $9.99 a month, this is what we call our super soldier level. And the super soldier level gets everything I just mentioned, plus you get once a year the opportunity to be a guest on our show, and you get to pick the topic, and you get to come on and talk about whatever it is you want to talk about.
That's a great deal, Rick.
I know, right? So these are just some ways that we wanted to give back to the people who are our patrons and who support us. So we're really excited about it. You can go, if you want to get more information, go to our website, which is real easy. It's CaptainAmericaComicBookFans.com. And you can get more information on there. And if you're so inclined, you can sign up for a donation. So anyway, that's something we're really, really excited about.
Yeah. And you better have that coin in your pocket if I see you.
That's right. or the round's on you.
Because I drink the expensive stuff. So you're not going to get away cheap.
Yeah. All right. So Bob, we're very excited to have our guest on today. He's the author of a fantastic book, which is called Captain America, Masculinity and Violence. And this came out. This came out in 2015, and then a paperback came out in 2018. So we're really excited to have the author on the podcast with us. So Bob, did you want to maybe give the listeners a little insight into his background?
Yeah, well, Rick, as you said, Dr. Stevens, he's a professor like myself, but he's I don't know how I stumbled into doing the professor thing. It just sort of happened, Rick. I guess I needed a job or something, right? I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. But Dr. Stevens, he's an associate professor and a department chair out at the College of Media, Communications, and Information at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on a range of things that sort of touch on popular culture, right? Popular culture, the media, which sort of focuses on what we're going to be talking about here tonight. So he's widely published. As you mentioned, he's written Captain America, Masculinity and Violence, but he's got a whole range of interests. But really the sorts of things that caught my attention when I stumbled across his work was his focus on Captain America. I mean, that's like fortuitous, right? There's some synchronicity there that this is something we all love and appreciate. So not only did he publish this book, but before he published the book, back in, I think, 2011, he published an article in the Journal of Popular Culture that examined this. You may be familiar with this. It was called the Rap with Cap letter controversy. Mm-hmm. Took place over about 6 years, starting around 1969. And then there were about 60 letters that he analyzed, and these were from fans, but also the responses from the different creative teams about what's the relationship between Captain America and patriotism, right? How does Cap exemplify patriotism? It was a very spirited debate, but it was an important debate in sort of the transformation of Cap that took him from that man out of time era that began in 1964 into the era of Friedrich and Engelhardt and everything that came after in the 70s. So it's a fascinating article, and I encourage everybody to look it up if you get a chance. He also wrote one the next year. It was in the International Journal of Motorcycle Studies, I think, and it sort of looked at 3 key issues that was Cap's first cross-country motorcycle trip, right? And how that sort of fed into this transformative path that Cap took from that earlier era to the era of the 1960s, and examine that through the lens of like comparing it to, you remember that movie in 1969, Easy Rider?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, right. Peter Fonda had the Captain America motorcycle helmet. Mm-hmm. So sort of contrasting and comparing those two different types of media and getting some insights from that. So I'm really excited to have this guy on tonight. Dr. Stevens, this book is one of my favorite books. I've read it a number of times. I read it again before the interview tonight, and I'm super excited to have him here, Rick. I'm like, I'm often excited, but I am super duper excited tonight.
Well, I'm excited as well. So let's go ahead and get to it. Okay, we're now joined by Dr. J. Richard Stevens, but he actually said we could call him Rick. So normally we would say there can only be one, but in your case, we're going to make an exception. So Dr. Stevens, Rick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And thank you for letting me use my name. I feel like we can be friends this way.
We love it.
I feel like the odd man out. I feel very uncomfortable about this.
Oh, whatever, Robert.
Okay, we're gonna go there, are we? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, I'm super excited to have you here tonight, Rick. I've read your book a number of times. I've read your several of your published articles. I always find them entertaining, illuminating, insightful. So for me, this is a real treat to have you here tonight. But I want to go way back in the beginning, right? Yeah. So in the preface of your book, you talk about how you became familiarized with the character of Captain America fairly early in your life. And so for the listeners who haven't read the book yet, because I know they will after they listen tonight, can you recount that story for us and let us know how that all began?
Yeah. So, like a lot of people, I read comics when I was younger. I had read kind of a mixture of DC and Marvel. I probably, as a kid, I was more of a Spider-Man person, but Captain America was always kind of there in that field. And so I kind of grew up really intrigued by him and how people would react to him and all of that. And then I stopped reading comics for a long time. I was working and went to college, and I just kind of stepped out. The 90s were not a great comic era for me personally.
Right.
And, boy, when I went back and reread a lot of that, I remembered why. But that was just a kind of a hiatus onto other things. And then in 2003, I was in a KB store in the mall, a KB toy store.
KB Toys, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember those.
And I was looking for a gift for my nephew, who at the time was really into Aquaman. And I don't know if you remember, but it was impossible to find Aquaman. For the longest time, that was not the most popular DC character. But while I was in there, I just happened to notice these Marvel inspirational posters. They were 8x10, they were framed, and they were put together, I guess to put on a kid's wall and kind of give them a little bit of inspiration. Like, for example, I remember Spider-Man's would say responsibility, and then, would have a quote underneath it: with great power comes great responsibility, etc. But the Captain America one caught my eye because it said patriotism. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, because most of these were like fortitude and responsibility and, all of these, and then patriotism. And it had a quote from John F. Kennedy from his 1961 inauguration. And that was an interesting time in our culture to be thinking about that. I was in grad school. America had invaded Iraq that year. This is when the war was starting to become less popular and people were starting to think about our mission abroad. And it just got me thinking, like, oh, patriotism, what would that even mean for Captain America right now, if he was, facing this? And so that just, I went on and did all the shopping and everything. And then it just kind of stuck with me. And then that led me to eventually go back and find that fourth volume of Captain America that came out in 2002. And boy, that was not what I was expecting, because at that point I was expecting Marvel Comics, like so many other outlets and industries, to be really safe. That was a big, moment where everybody was wearing flag pins and everybody was very, on message with the government. And here you have this 2002 Captain America series where he's questioning whether S.H.I.E.L.D. can be trusted, whether S.H.I.E.L.D. had something to do with 9/11, whether, terrorists were really evil or villains, or, where does America fit into this messy world where we have decades of legacies of operations that went bad and all of this stuff. And I just thought, wow, comics are not what I thought they were. And that was the Marvel Knight series. It was more for adults. I just hadn't known they had done all of that. Right. So that kind of stuck with me, and that got me asking questions about what had come before that and what was happening after that. I started reading comics again. And the more I did that, the more I started to see these patterns and trends that just kept working on me.
And then right down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. And it just kept going. I mean, and I would probably say that gave me my third data point of a different Captain America. I had a couple of Captain Americas from my childhood, and I knew, he had gone through some transitions. And then I saw that one being markedly different. And then that led me to, what are some other data points, some other moments where transitions happened and different things came on. And then that eventually I started writing about my reading of comics, and then a database came about. And then here we go. I'm headed for something. Yeah.
Here we are.
So, in when we talk about your book, which is Captain America, Masculinity and Violence, what would you describe as the main argument of the book?
Oh, sure. So, it's that cultural values, and in particular masculinity, which I know we'll probably talk about in just a minute, that these concepts are socially constructed, but that means they're a product of their age and their environment. And that when we look at these long-standing heroes, Captain America, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, that exist over many decades, they actually wind up reinventing themselves over and over in order to fit kind of the marketplace needs of the given era. And yet they do that in a rhetoric that says they're timeless and they don't change. And so there's a paradox in there about our own history, our own culture, our own way of talking about ourselves, that I think is reflected through these long comic book histories. I know you wanted concise, but that was
No, that's an excellent argument, and I think it sums it up very nicely.
Yeah, you actually let's talk about masculinity, right? Because It's in the title, and it's a key focus of the book, as well as its relationship with violence itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think basically you make an argument that sort of how Captain America sort of exemplifies masculinity, and his use of violence has evolved over time. But can you sort of maybe give us a thumbnail of what exactly do you mean by masculinity? Because, I think a lot of folks say, they see the title of the book, they're not academics, and they're like, masculinity and violence, what is this, right?
Yeah.
I know I did when I first saw it, but then I read the book and I was like, oh, I get it now.
Yeah. Well, so let me boil it down a little bit. So masculinity studies aren't something that we talk about in our culture. And part of that, so let me contrast it to, say, feminism. Feminism has noted discourses. We can look at certain points. Here's where people started talking about this, and all of a sudden there was a movement, there was an argument, there was a discussion, and then here's another cultural moment. And masculinity doesn't really work that way, because part of its narrative is that it's natural. And that's like this cultural myth we have that men are men because men are natural. And yet masculinity, it differs. There's a broad range of practices of the way that we express manhood, what's accepted. It's different in different times. It's different in different places. But see how that kind of matches that mythology about patriotism is this evolution that comes into it. So it's kind of that invisible value that's interesting to me. So when we say masculinity, it's the construction of the identity of malehood. And Captain America, of course, is the perfect male, right? I mean, that's his
perfect man, right?
Yeah. He takes a serum and gets Vita rays, and suddenly he is the ultimate perfect male. So what he does kind of becomes an exemplar for what maleness is supposed to be. And, we can look at other sites, like in some of my other classes, we'll talk about sports. Sports become this site of, when we watch NFL players, they become this exemplar of what men are supposed to be, even though that represents 1% of the population that can do those things, but they become kind of the norm of what aspirations are supposed to match to. And superheroes are like that. They express these extreme values that then influence what we think is normative.
Okay. All right. So you make a compelling argument in the book, I think anyway, for this sort of evolution of the reinterpretation of Captain America, right? And it's across different eras, different social, cultural contexts. Things change, different creative teams. There's the input of fandom. But like you mentioned earlier, there's this paradox where, a central tenet of Captain America is that he is, he's immutable, right? He's eternal. He doesn't change, right? He's the same. And yet we see these evolutions, these transformations from era to era to era that you lay it out in your book, chapter by chapter. I mean, how do we reconcile this?
Yeah, well, part of it is that we reconcile it through the magic of comics, because, comics have their own rhetoric, and they make a certain kind of sense, but not a real sense. Marvel comics in particular struggle with this a lot, because as opposed to, say, DC Comics that has Metropolis and Gotham and all of these, not real places, Marvel is set in New York City on certain streets, certain blocks, certain buildings, certain times, certain events. And there was the time early on in the Silver Age where they were mapping year by year. Peter Parker is going to advance 1 year every year of this comic, but then they get popular and they become brands, and you can't really do that because otherwise Peter Parker's too old to be Spider-Man pretty fast. And this was the classic, Ditko wanted wanted Spider-Man to die because that would be the normal life process of this character. And there was no way Marvel was going to let that happen when they were making so much money. Captain America, though, presents a particular challenge because his events are tied up in very nailed down dates. We're talking about World War II. You can't move World War II around. It happened in a particular time and place. The events that are referred to it, they're referred to in his books, but then you also have this formula that you want to keep, which is Captain America is this man at a time. He's got greatest generation values. He gets to comment on modern society and not understand parts of it, but speak truth and wisdom into it. But if he's here too long, right, he'll assimilate. And you don't want that to happen because then he loses all of his explanatory power. And so Captain America is in this fuzzy zone. And so some of the paradoxes that you're talking about, the idea of Captain America is he's been out of the ice 10 years, but that 10 years keeps moving. It's like this telescoping movement of it. But meanwhile, I can go back in the text and say, there he is talking to Nixon. There he is talking to Carter. There he is talking to Reagan. There he is talking to Clinton in like 10. This is not 10 years. Right. And so you kind of have this fuzzy continuity, adjustment that's occurring where Marvel Comics wants to say that all of this is happening in lived reality that we'll recognize, but you have to fudge it some in order to keep the character in stasis young enough and, vibrant enough to meet his formula, or else he becomes somebody else. And they don't want these heroes to become someone else without them choosing that. So yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, right. It's complex stuff, right? And you got to appeal to each new successive generation.
Right.
So there's one other sort of theme, or not theme, but concept threaded throughout the book, and it's this idea of the American monomyth. And how Cap sort of fits into that American monomyth, right? Sure. So can you tell us a little bit about what that actually is?
Yeah, let me unpack that. And I'll reference kind of the scholarly approach to this, and then kind of decode it a little bit. So in literature, what we're really talking about is starting with the concept of a monomyth, like Joseph Campbell's monomyth. People who like Star Wars are very enamored with Campbell's work. But this idea in his book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, that, there's really only certain set story patterns that work in Western civilization over and over. And that's just kind of how our mythology works. The American monomyth is a particular pattern that's kind of a subset of that. But what it does is it introduces the element of seriality. So I know all of that's already like, what are we talking about? Let me get it down on the ground. So a Western, the movie Shane is like the perfect American monomyth because it has this pattern. You have this person who has specific abilities that are exceptional. He's a gunslinger, but he's trying to put it away. There's a reluctance to use these skills. And so he's witnessing evil happening in his community, but he's resisting taking action until somebody goes too far, in this case, Jack Palance, and does something so bad that now righteous whoop ass becomes the solution. And now he gets to shoot anybody, and it's okay. It's justified because this violence occurred that justifies everything that comes after that. But then the American monomyth part is what would happen in the monomyth is then he enters society as this transgressor and he dies. It's tragedy, yada, yada, yada. But the serial part is no, he rides off into the sunset. He's got to go to another community because he can't be judged by what he's done. He's the superhero. He's above all of this. And so he goes on to his next town, and this process probably starts all over again. So we see that with Westerns. Braveheart, Mel Gibson in Braveheart is the perfect monomyth. I mean, he follows that pattern to a T. We see that in spaghetti Westerns. We see that in action movies in the 80s. That is John Rambo, Chuck Norris, Arnold Schwarzenegger, they all follow that pattern. And you see it in superheroes. The difference being superheroes wear a mask so that their identity isn't known, so that they don't get dragged into court and have to answer for it. But it's this idea that society cannot govern itself. It needs these super saviors. And here's how the righteous version of that is going to work, in a way that we say, here are people breaking the law, but they're doing it in a way that has a higher calling or a higher good, a higher righteousness. And that's the American monomyth. Now, that was used in the 70s to talk about Vietnam as a very troubling mythology, that when we think of ourselves as a culture, as superheroes, we get into things that we don't want to talk out. We want to act. That's also been used to talk about foreign policy in some of our more recent conflicts. But that's the social criticism coming out of it. The literary pattern is about how we come to these ideas. Like, why do we like these heroes? And what do they tell us is right in the way that they're breaking the law, in a sense.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you talk about these different time periods, and you bring them together as far as some different analogies, with the Westerns and things like that. So, but
Sure.
This has been going back, not just decades. This has been going back generations, right? This is the way human culture kind of explains things. So, Cap's been around 80 years. So let's, I guess, go back to, the 40s when he was introduced. And he was a rage, right? It was, incredibly popular. But then there became a time, during what is referred to as the golden age, in the 40s, where he kind of fell out of favor. And then in the post-war, now during the war, huge. Post-war, kind of fell out of favor. And then there was that, a brief introduction in the 50s, the commie smasher. Right. So what do you think led to his declining popularity in these instances?
Yeah, so there's a couple of variables at work. As a media scholar, I have to say there's multiple things, but one way of explaining that is that American consumer tastes are fickle, and they shift as we enter new environments. But the other part of it is that these are different audiences as well. So one element that even predates where you started that was when Captain America Comics #1 comes out. It was polarizing. It was popular, but it was very polarizing because there were some people that did not like that messaging, him punching Hitler. And it was, a year later when Pearl Harbor happens, we go to war, and suddenly, well, now everybody's on board. That becomes even more popular. At the time, Timely Comics thinks of their audience for that book as GIs and kids. And this is such a strange marriage of market demographics, but it's, it is our troops and it is our children, and we are telling the same mythology to both of them, but it's the war. And, for people at home that are constantly reading these headlines and thinking about what's going on over there, reading stories about it is cathartic and it's empowering, and, it's really important. And then the war ends, and all of a sudden Captain America becomes more of a cop and, is telling more social stories, trying to stay relevant when people don't really want to think about the war that is over, that they're kind of trying to put it behind them. And then that's kind of what happened in this 50s moment that you're alluding to. The Adventures of Superman comes out, and suddenly it looks like superheroes are back and it's big money. And so Timely rolls out the Human Torch on a cover to say, look, we've got a Superman too. And people didn't want the comics of that. They wanted television. And so those just bombed. I mean, they just never quite caught a readership. There were only 8 issues total, 16 stories. It just didn't really resonate. And again, commie smasher didn't really signify Nazi to the new generation. The Cold War was just not the same war. And people didn't spend all their time thinking in these very propaganda-like jingoistic terms the way they had in the 40s. And in fact, it was kind of in poor taste to some people. And again, that's just that fickle changing of the guard. But also think about the kids in 1940. When you get to 1954, they're not kids, so they're not reading these books. So we were trying to get the new kids, and it just didn't work. they had lightning in a bottle for about 5 years, and then it was kind of diminishing returns until the resurgence that came with the Silver Age and things like that.
Right,
Television messed it up too. So
yeah, of course, yeah.
Well, you talk about the resurgence, right? So in what is it, March 1964, Cap is back, right? They found him, yay! And he's in the Avengers. And then we start to see other appearances, Tales of Suspense. He comes out in his own book, The Man Out of Time. And then we see another one of these sort of these transitions on his evolutionary path, right? From the 60s, The Man Out of Time, to what you call the liberal crusader of the 70s.
Right.
And essentially this sets him on the path to becoming, I think, what we could all agree, and what others have characterized him as the moral center of the Marvel universe.
Right.
So can you tell us why do you think this transition happened, and how it happened, and what's the enduring legacy of that first transition? Yeah.
So of course, as a fan, what I want to say is, Marvel tells great stories, but really it comes down to markets again, and it comes down to the popularity of certain stories, certain books. And what was really interesting in that era was that the Avengers book was growing in popularity, but Captain America in his solo books wasn't. First of all, it was barely the same character. Captain America in the Avengers books tends to be, once he gets past that initial moment, he's the leader. I don't know if you remember, but he, it was Captain America and 3 teenagers. That was the Avengers. And so you had these kind of generational conflicts between the greatest generation and the and the kids these days, and how they're being superheroes. But in his own book, it was brooding and thinking about the war. It was Jack Kirby working some stuff out, trying to bring the 40 stories to the present, and
pining for Bucky.
Yeah, right. Constantly brooding for Bucky and constantly regretting those moments. And then, the Red Skull and the Sleepers and all of those things are happening. But Marvel Comics at that point is being read by mostly college students. And they figured that out from the letter columns, that the college students were not really fond of Captain America's conservative greatest generation politics in some of the ways when he would fight the Red Skull and get very jingoistic, and which, I mean, to Jack Kirby's defense, he's like, I created this character, this is who he is. I mean, this is the whole point. And it's not matching up with the taste, though, of the college kids. This move towards the liberal crusader frame is what I call it, really comes when Jack Kirby leaves that book. And all of a sudden Marvel starts putting some younger, hipper, countercultural kinds of writers like Steve Englehart, people like that are suddenly trying to think about what would a patriotic hero do when he confronts the politics of the new left. And so he does this Easy Rider motorcycle tour across America. He witnesses the riots at Berkeley. He, all these things that are just kind of touchstones of that era. And he's changed by that. And that's really these younger writers trying to put their stamp on that. And that drew a lot of attention and suddenly kind of transformed him. He's also, this is where the Falcon comes in, and the Harlem race riots are a part of this equation. But I do think it was chasing that readership. It was trying to keep those loud voices coming from the college student readers somewhat happy, or at least engaged, when it looked like they were starting to become very dissatisfied.
Right. So that brings us to, because I think right now we're talking about the 70s, right? So for the most part. And so you're right. The different, you had Steve Englehart come in. That was a big difference. And then you have Roy Thomas, who's an editor, longtime writer on the Avengers and Invaders. So he's no stranger to Cap, right?
Yeah.
In fact, Roy Thomas, when he was growing up reading Cap, he had this love for the Golden Age tales. So, and that's why he was so good at the Invaders. But he also, when it came to the Invaders, he set this standard that Captain America doesn't kill.
Right.
And so how and why did that happen? Was it just a a nod to the, the Comics Code Authority that was still going on at that time, which was trying to prohibit this violence that, in the Silver and the Bronze Ages, or is it more of that philosophical reason, of trying to look at the readership and say, okay, let's smooth over some of Cap's golden age rough edges and try to appease to these new readers?
Yeah, I think with Roy Thomas, it's more the latter, because right before that, when you have Jack Kirby do his origin, do Captain America's origin, it is somewhat sanitized, but Captain America still kills the Nazi agent. And he does do some things. There are moments where he does. It's just severely, and I think that's the code where they're, in my book, that I count lots of things. It's all count up how many times Captain America killed people in different eras. And the 40s, he was very bloodthirsty, just in his actions. But when you get to the 60s, in the 70s, you see it diminish. But Roy Thomas, first of all, The Invaders seems to me to be I want to make the World War II stories for kids specifically. And I want them to, so in other words, I want them to be able to know some of these stories that I knew, but that means I'm going to rewrite the way that those worked. And of course, he added characters and all kinds of, the Invaders is great stuff. But it kind of reimagines all of that into more of a modern superhero epic. But the reason I think that probably this is a little bit more of his own sensibilities is when he gets around to writing his origin story for Captain America, he's the one that decides Captain America is a pacifist, and that Captain America was an artist, and that and the way that he did this with this big move was to say he was a pacifist artist. He was against the war until his now inserted brother died at Pearl Harbor, and that's why Steve Rogers goes to war. But in his heart of hearts, he does not kill. He doesn't want to kill. He doesn't want to use guns. He doesn't want to do any of that. He is doing this because he was forced to. And of course, some of that would later be changed by others,
Right.
But some of that stayed and, became especially poignant in the 80s, where they started saying things like, he had never killed and all of that. But I think that's Roy Thomas's stamp. I mean, he really did do a lot of the mythological underwork for Captain America. And I really think starting with What If #4, where he starts, here is how we make modern continuity work with Captain America in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and and that became kind of the pattern for Marvel going forward. In a way, you could say he invented the new continuity model, just in that what if exercise. But I think that is Roy's sensibilities. He wants heroes that are the good guys, and they're going to be the good guys because they're not just extremely strong, they're extremely moral, and they're extremely resistant to giving in to quick, violent solutions. I think that's his stamp.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say that was carried on, I think, in Mark Grunwald's run.
Oh, totally. Oh, yeah. He took it to and we may talk about that separately, but he took that to that moment where the fans reacted to him saying Captain America had never shot anybody before, and did finally in the 80s. And it becomes this big thing where he goes on national television to apologize for having used a gun. And readers were like, I've got all these comics. He used guns. I know he did. But yeah, so Roy started that, but you're right. It really did get amplified. And that's what happens with these. One writer will make a change and suddenly just amplifies and becomes the new myth. And then it just grows from there.
That's a nice segue, Rick, because on several occasions in the book, you talk about this sort of tension, right, between the creative teams, and they change. I mean, sometimes rapidly, sometimes they're on for a long time, but sometimes there's pretty quick turnover, right? I mean, Gary Friedrich wasn't on the book very long, and yet he had a pretty substantial role making that transition from Lee's writing to Steve Englehart's.
Right.
And so there's the tension between the creative teams and the fandom, right? The fans' expectations, particularly with characters that are very near and dear to them. So, I mean, this can be really challenging, right? When you're trying to balance new readers with the long-standing readers, because there can be different expectations, and you discuss this quite often in your book. And you make sort of the argument that like it can be really challenging because we tend to find as normative the books, the creative teams, the stories that we are first introduced to a character.
Right.
Those become the norm for us, and everything else is sort of a deviation from that. And so from generation to generation, you can have obviously different norms, and we see the deviations very, very differently. So now, how is it that Marvel has been, I mean, pretty darn successful in managing these tensions for so long?
Yeah, well, part of it, I think that the question of looking at it the other side, which is how are they so not good at that now, is because of the changing loyalty of the market and the intensity of it. But you're not wrong. The way in which they massage characters through these transitions, you'll have this seminal experience with a character, and then even when they change something, and they will change dramatically some things. Usually with Captain America, it's when he stops being Captain America. When he comes back to being Captain America, the way that rhetoric is going to work is he's back. The legend is back. And I'm like, but if you pay attention, he's not the same Captain America that was wearing the cowl before he took it off. It's kind of like the new Coke Classic thing. Coke Classic is not actually original Coke, but there was a transition in there because they use these disruptive moments and continuity to kind of bring people along. And they do lose readers sometimes, but if they gain more, it is a business at the end of the day. And especially when you're talking about those 70s and 80s moments, that's when Marvel was coming into its heyday. Everything before that had been scratching and clawing, especially on this character. And so there's this, again, the magic of comics, this way of bringing people along where even when they start to resist and hate something, so long as you find a formula that makes it make sense enough, then they'll hang on. What's really interesting is when you have an experience like mine, or like I'm sure a lot of people's, where you can go through a few transitions, then stop reading, and then coming back becomes very, very hard. Because in your mind, this character has been consistent. We do that every time I watch a political fight over Superman. That's what's going on, is somebody hasn't read Superman in 2 decades and just assumes they know who Superman is. And that's not who that character is anymore. And but our nostalgia, our memory, our social identity that gets wrapped up in these characters, that's what we that's what we're fighting about most of the time. And I just think in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was a different era. We were more accepting of some of that as comics fans, I think. But also they were a lot more intentional about not taking hard left turns all the time on characters. That used to be one of the jokes, right? Here's a character that's going to die, but we know they're not really going to die. This is all about getting us to expect a big change, but it's really going to be status quo. And I just think, that formula eventually became actual change, and people were a little less tolerant of that. I think Marvel has always chased new audiences and tried to keep as many of the existing readership, but has always sacrificed the old for the new. And that's been what has led to the fragmentation of culture problem of today. We can't all agree on what we like about any of it because the readership is too fragmented.
Yeah, we see a lot of that in our Facebook group. So we have over 4,000 Captain America fans in the group. So, and we have some that just recently became fans because of the MCU. Yeah. We have some that, go back to, I remember when when Cap was, introduced in Avengers 4, I picked it up at the local grocery store. So, so there's I think it goes back to what Bob had said and you had expanded on, which is, the one that we're introduced to the character is the one that is the right version, and anything else is a deviation from that. So that being said, so for me, I started reading Cap in 1983. The writer at the time was J.M. DeMatteis.
Yep.
So to me, and I always tell people, yes, my favorite character is Captain America, but really, honestly, my favorite fictional character of all time is Steve Rogers. And why is that? And that's because DeMatteis wrote him as someone who was more than just the costume and the shield. Right. So in chapter 6 of your book, you talk about the creative teams that begin to spend a lot more time exploring character development of Steve Rogers, and filling in a lot of the detail about his life, his relationships out of the uniform. So what do you think helped kind of precipitate this shift?
Oh, yeah. Well, part of that, if you look around in pop culture, and this is part of what my orientation to media studies is about, is that none of this happens in a vacuum. People are, especially not Marvel Comics. I mean, Marvel Comics, you can always, where did Iron Fist and Shang-Chi come from? It's because Kung Fu movies were popular. Where did Luke Cage come from? Blaxploitation. People start talking about surfing. We get the Silver Surfer. There's this constant bubble of culture that's moving, that we're seeing played out in pages. And I just think when we're talking about late 70s, but man, in the 80s, especially the era you're talking about, think about the films and the soap operas and the way that sitcoms were delving into personal lives. And I think that started to play out in Marvel Comics, and not just for Steve Rogers. I mean, Steve Rogers goes from, Bucky Bruder, who wants to be a cop, who decides he can't be a cop, who, this very kind of superficial, should I be a SHIELD agent or not, to suddenly having a building that he lives in with complex interactions and, the potluck, and what should a guy from the 40s make for a potluck? All these kind of like domestic things. But that also matches what people were interested in media at the time. And so I think it's representative of its moment. But that having been said, it takes special writers to translate that into comics and to make you care. That 1983 moment is really great, but it's also right before Secret Wars, which is like this moment where Captain America gets solidified as, he doesn't have powers, but he's the guy that he's the grandpa superhero with all the moral certitude that's going to tell everybody how to be. And all that happened in the 80s because of Reagan, because of society, because of the way we were talking about interpersonal lives. We were feeling better about being Americans, but we were more interested in our consumerism. I mean, all of these things are changing at the same time. And you've got great writers who are drawing from those trends and putting them into books and fleshing out these characters. So yeah, it's a testament to its time in a way.
I think it was the same chapter, in fact. You talk about right about that time, the shift toward the direct market, right? The local comic stands, the local comic stores, and this burgeoning market for back issues, and of course, Marvel is really focusing on servicing fandom. And so about this time, you start to see things like the publication of the official handbook of the Marvel Universe and Marvel Saga, and how important, you talk about how important sort of that move was to cementing some of these continuity issues around who Cap is, right? Because until that time, there'd been a lot of different sort of tellings of Cap's origin, right? And a lot of differences here and there, but there needed to be one sort of core story, right? That this was the lawful story, the normative story. Can you talk about that a little bit? How important that was?
And so those two books are both they're both different for different reasons. So the Handbook to the Marvel Universe, and See, when I came in, I'll date myself as I didn't read the first one. I read the second one, right? And that was like, I think 85. So I was my most formative Captain America was in this 83, 84, and on era. That's the one that I recognize the most. But part of that also is because of these handbooks. So if you think about these handbooks as the Marvel, character Bibles, that it's what their writers are using for the shared reference. And a lot of that stuff came from fandom. To be honest, like the first indexes that were published were actually fan products that Marvel then blessed and published, and that writers started saying, man, fans have all this worked out and we can just look up when things happened. And that started leading to these kind of histories that were being written by characters. Marvel Saga is a very interesting problem. It's basically Marvel saying, man, we are more popular than ever, but our readers are younger and they didn't read the old stuff. They don't know where the Fantastic Four came from. And I mean, what are we going to do? Republish everything we've ever done over and over? And so Marvel Saga is a cut and paste book. I mean, it really does. It takes panels out of key moments in Marvel history, and then it has textual narrative under it. But it's designed to be, if you want to know what Marvel history is, read this. And that's going to catch you up. Now, having said that, they made a lot of editorial choices to put all of these three, the indexes, the Handbook to the Marvel Universe, and Marvel Saga together, because there has to be one history, and these three have to kind of line up. But of course, that's really privileging the current moment. So in other words, in many ways, if you read Captain America's history in the pages of the Marvel Handbook, it's really, how did the writers wish Captain America's history actually had been all along, not what was it really? And that's the kind of continuity they're working with. But for a new reader, that becomes the authoritative history. So older fans can all, in letter columns, point all they want to this moment in 1975 when this happened. New fans are like, well, it's not in the handbook, so it must not have been important. And this history just keeps evolving and it kind of atomizes. So making official histories like that, it does more destruction to the publication history than it actually does, create history. But what it does is it creates continuity, and it creates a jumping on point, and a reference guide that then becomes kind of the trump card in any nerd fight, which is to say, in the handbook it says this, so therefore that's what it was. And then when an older fan starts to argue about, no, I've read it in a different comic, come on, man, get on board, right? There's a handbook. The handbook, it tells you what it is. But that is, of course, serving Marvel writers first and foremost, and their ability to tell modern stories in a coherent way.
Right. Interesting.
So, when we talk about trying to retell these stories, a lot of times there are very different what's the right word I'm looking for? Just alternative histories, right? So
sure.
The term we use is retcon, right? So, and you use that in your book quite frequently. And we talk about it sometimes during our various podcasts where we bring up some of the retcon stories. But for those who aren't familiar, can you explain what you mean by this term? And then how is it used by the different creative teams to adapt a character like Captain America? And we talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to get a little bit further into the retcon theory.
Yeah. So a retcon is a retroactive continuity tool. And it's basically, in narrative storytelling, it's a tool that is used to change the status quo in order for there to be more story. So when I'm talking to people about continuity and storytelling strategies, we talk about part of the American monomyth problem is what we call the tyranny of the serial, which means that the story can't end. If the story ends, you make no money the next month. And so because there has to be more story and more money made next month, you can never quite close off these stories. There's never an end to them. But what that means is that whenever you do something significant with a character, you start writing yourself into corners. And you start every choice you make, you're taking other choices off the board that can be made later. So when we have a retroactive continuity, it's a way of revisiting those earlier decisions and changing them to give more latitude for storytelling. Anybody who's watched Lost knows, man, that whole story is about retcon. We don't know where the show's going to go, so let's retcon a new character in, and suddenly we're going to take a new direction. With Captain America, he has more than 20 different tellings of his origin story, and every one of them retcons a different element. Origin stories are an obvious place where that happens, and usually that happens when a new creative team comes on and they're retelling the origin because they're communicating to the audience, this is my take on Captain America. These are the kinds of stories you can expect from me, but also I'm tweaking some things that are going to help me tie what's happening now back to his origin, which actually changes his origin. And so the character will go through these gradual shifts in order to let the new creative team tell a new kind of Captain America story that the old creative team had never envisioned. But they need something. Roy, the one that always jumps to my mind is Roy Thomas needs Steve Rogers to have a brother. And that's so for a little while, Captain America had a dead brother. And then all of a sudden that went away.
Until Roger Stern got a hold of it. Yes.
Right. And then we just kind of, we'll retcon back to that was a fever dream that didn't happen, right? And that's okay. Readers will accept that as long as the storytelling is good and it matches, it makes the current story work. But it's used in movie series, television series, novels. It's kind of the lubricant that makes old stories become new again without having to start over. It's a continuation lubricant.
You and I seem to have started reading Cap around the same time, right? So J.M. DeMatteis was the writer at the time, and he certainly did some of what you just explained, right? He brings back Arnie Roth, introduces Arnie Roth, who was a childhood friend.
Right.
He takes Helmut Zemo, who died, right, as the Phoenix, and brings him back as Baron Zemo. So he did a lot of that. Did you have any, I don't know, particular stories that were retcon during Cap's evolving characterization that perhaps you enjoyed or were important to you?
Oh yeah, and I'll specify that enjoyed and are important are two very different categories for me.
Good point. Yes,
which is because the first one I'm going to talk about is the constant retconning around Samuel Wilson and the attempts to try to repair the damage that had been done to him in the 70s. That all happened before I started reading, but it's one of the things that led me back to earlier comics because I was trying to figure out, what's going on with this character. And there was a little bit of me that was like, why are they trying so hard? I mean, they really are trying hard to make this particular character be some things. He had his own series. I don't know if you remember what was going on in the Avengers at that point, but he was added to the Avengers through an affirmative action policy by the government, and Hawkeye was mad about that because he is the white Avenger, got displaced, and all of those politics. And I was still a little too young to quite grasp why all of that was socially important. But those were some of the important pieces. I really liked during that run, Steve Rogers' relationship with Bernie. The Arnie Roth was really interesting to me, that we were going to have this exploration of a gay character in a time when that was not talked about, and we just weren't going to really bring that out. But that was, again, that kind of personalness of him, which when I would go back and read earlier stories, I'd be like, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't, where is he coming from? But probably the biggest retcon that I enjoyed the most was when 50s Bucky comes back as Nomad, and suddenly becomes his sidekick. And for me, Captain America Nomad, after I had known that Cap had been Nomad, right? I mean, that was just such a cool set of relationships and storytelling pieces. That is one of the things that was so disappointing in the Brubaker run, was the killing of that character. But that's only because I had nostalgia, right, that was wrapped up in it. So it made sense why you had to do that. That's a
big point of contention in the Facebook group. Whenever we talk about Brubaker, everybody consistently always says, seminal volume. It's an amazing story. It's all agreed upon. But
yeah.
Why did you have to kill Jack Monroe?
Yeah.
So there's that. Yeah.
Well, this is, again, putting on my narrative hat, because what do you do with Jack Monroe out there when Cap and Bucky are having that dance? I mean, it becomes this really awkward kind of third wheel, and it's also symbolic of Bucky, how much he was willing to hurt Cap, and all of these things that were happening in there. But at the same time, man, that was a gut punch, and I don't think I've ever really gotten over that part. I'm with you on the sentiment for it.
Yeah, it's a great story. And I'm glad you brought up the Falcon too, because we actually covered that in episode 14, which was the origin of the Falcon. And we actually went through the introduction of the Falcon. And then when Steve Englehart retconned it, and then DeMatteis basically re-retconned it because of the whole, what did they refer to him as? Who was the bad Sam Wilson? It was Snap.
Yeah. The pimp drug dealer. Yeah.
Right. And that never set well with DeMatteis.
It killed the character too for the audience at the time. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and then I think Nick Spencer retconned it again recently in the last 5 years to say that never happened, that he was never Snap.
Right.
So it's funny. It all comes back to what you said, Rick, and that is, the writer, to the times, to the audience, is going to, shape the story to fit.
Right. Yeah. And part of that is the environment in which they are writing. I don't know how far you want to get into Nick Spencer's treatment of the character, but there's certain kinds of stories he wants to tell, and to do that, he has to reposition not just Falcon, but also Steve Rogers and a few other core characters in order to catch that political moment, which went completely sideways on him, and he kind of lost control of. But all of them, it kind of illustrates this is the paradox of being a comics writer, where you want to have a contemporary voice and you want to talk about contemporary politics and historic moments that are happening right in front of you, but your characters weren't set up to do that. And so then you wind up tweaking them in some ways, not in popular ways. Sometimes you get away with it and sometimes they don't. So, yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
But you've touched on this a little bit with your discussion of the Nick Spencer run. So, Cap has been taken to task a number of times over the, decades, right? For patriotism, right? He's either blindly a patriot or he's not patriotic enough. And, before you published the book, you published the article in the Journal of Popular Culture, and you talk about this in the book as well, about that letter writing controversy, the Rap with Cap letter writing controversy that took place over 6 years, right? And there was this struggle to sort of get their hands around what does patriotism mean with respect to Captain America, right? And the fans were in on that, the creative teams were in on that, and are these disputes just you can't please everyone all the time sort of thing, or is there something else going on here that we can learn from that episode?
Yeah, no, I think there's more going on there in my head, and I know if I say it the way I think it, I'm going to say it anyway. I'm going to make some people mad. I always think of that 6-year letter fight as a little bit of, in my head, I have it under a category called the education of Jack Kirby. But I know that makes people angry when they think about it, because that started with some of Jack Kirby's portrayals of patriotism. It is more than just you can't please everyone. It's this moment where you've got college readers who are now writing in and saying things like, why isn't Captain America in Vietnam? And how can Captain America be expressing these values and be letting this Vietnam draft happen and letting all of this injustice that we're seeing happen in racial injustice, all of these, the riots that are occurring. And, it starts off there. And I think that kind of caught the Marvel team by surprise, how serious, how fervent, and how long it went. But you're right. It's this really interesting construction that I think is educating everybody involved, that when you just say patriotism and you just talk about it, this is, again, what I'm going to call a socially constructed value. It exists in a moment, and people in that moment recognize it and connect to it. But that doesn't mean it's the same thing in the next moment. It's constantly moving, and how you apply it and think about it can change. So, for example, do we feel that fighting for your country is good is a different question than do you feel like all citizens are treated the same? And depending on how you frame that question, and then you throw the word patriotism in there, people, depending on their own social identities and politics, are going to have very different reactions to it, and they're going to fight about it. The letter column fight, like you said, it lasted for 6 years. I think it led to editorial changes in the book, and that's why it's so significant. Comics have always been closer to their audience than, say, movies or TV series. And so you can kind of see that in the midst of that, I'm not saying that the letter fight is what got Jack Kirby kicked off of Captain America, but he did leave, and suddenly these new creators came in that were more progressive, and suddenly Captain America's direction changed. And that was, I think, in response to the articulated arguments that are happening in this book by the college students. Now, Jack Kirby came back to the book after that. It's not like I'm saying he lost it or anything like that, but it just goes to show that in these times of cultural stress, like during the Vietnam War, during civil rights, during all of these things happening in this very short amount of time, people's identities get wrapped up in these narratives, and they don't feel the same about them. And they're more likely to argue about, how can we be great if my friend was killed, and if, there's still racism and I'm not being treated well, and all of these things. And these are the kind of cultural conversations, I think, that lead to the next wave of culture and understanding. But it was just fascinating to see that play out almost every single issue for 6 years in the letters pages. It's what bulletin boards and Facebook are today, but back then it was just played out around a comic character. It's just fascinating.
Right. Yeah, and I think the three of us, and of course the listeners, we've seen that exact same conversation come up again when in volume 4. Right. Yep. We saw it come up again with the assassination of Captain. We saw it come up again recently. So this is sort of a perennial conversation. So it's interesting. One of the other things that I find really interesting is you talk about how Cap sort of eventually, because of the weight he takes on as the moral center of the Marvel universe, he starts to have this ability to almost confer his endorsement on other characters that may be perceived as somewhat controversial by readers. So not only is he, he's got this weight of authority in the book, but he's, extra authority outside of the book to the readership themselves, the fandom. And you bring up a couple examples. For example, you bring up Carol Danvers when she assumes the mantle of Captain Marvel. And again, when he hands the shield over to Sam, when Sam becomes Captain America. And these were two somewhat controversial character choices in the storyline, but Cap's moral authority was used to confer an endorsement, right? And I find that really fascinating. I don't know if could you comment on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. And to tease out a little bit, the Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers thing was so strategic and really smart. They knew that the moment they called Carol Danvers Captain Marvel, there were going to be some people that were saying, how dare you? And, what do you think you're doing? And just by narratively having Captain America be the one to convince her, she doesn't, again, she has her own monomyth going on around this name. And, Captain America is having to talk her into it and convince her, and finally does, so that it also sets up this kind of, well, if you're upset about this, argue with Cap. Don't argue with Carol. She didn't want to do it. Captain America made her do it. Your problem's with Steve Rogers, so take it out on him. But that's and especially with the Sam thing, it's like whenever they get to a moment where they want to take these stories into these controversial areas, his opinion just does carry that weight, even though these are all artificial characters. You can make any one of these characters say anything, but that the significance of it, it has different weight from different characters. And that's why it's important, people complain about, why are there two Spider-Men, and why were there two Thors, and why were there two Iron Men, and why were and that's, it is important to have the legacies passed down, but also that kind of endorsement to let these characters have those connections and room, to at least try to shoulder, that challenge and that struggle. And then, it's comics. If you don't like it and it doesn't sell, they will change it. That's the one thing we know that's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
It's funny, talking about Cap and endorsing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and why is that? Well, it's because everybody seems to look up to Cap, right?
Right.
I mean, he
Right.
has this moral authority. He is, for the center of the Marvel universe. And, it's interesting. So speaking of looking up to Cap, in the Civil War story, everybody kind of looked up to Cap. Well, not everybody, but, there was two sides, obviously, right? But one character that was torn was Peter Parker, and he really looked up to Steve Rogers. And so there's a big speech in around that time. It was an Amazing Spider-Man 537, which came out in 2006. And it's a speech where Cap is talking to Spider-Man, and he says, it's off of Mark Twain's commentary.
Right.
You're right. And it builds off of that. And he says, when the mob and the press and the whole world tell you to move, your job is to plant yourself like a tree besides the river of truth and tell the whole world, no, you move.
Yeah.
And, Bob and I talk about how Captain America is like a mirror, right? Because different people see different things when looking at him, know, and so most people in our Facebook group, like I said, we have 4,000 Cap fans, love that speech. It's one of their favorites.
Yeah.
I'm one of those guys who look at that speech and I say, I don't love the speech because Dr. Doom could be listening to that and say, you're right, Cap.
Yeah.
I need to plant myself and stick to my guns. The Punisher could be looking at him and say that. The Red Skull could be looking at him, so I don't know. We have many different types of Captain America fans, and none of us are better than others or right or wrong, right? You have those who maybe are like you and me and grew up on DeMatteis and love Steve Rogers and maybe, that type of, you have those who maybe, hey, Commie Smasher, excellent. That's my Cap, or Ultimate Captain America. So what do you think of this particular quote that is so endeared to many Captain America fans, and how do you face it?
So let me tease it out, because I'm going to agree with you, and then I'm going to turn and set it in its place of what the character motivation. So one of the things that you're saying, we do have this problem because those of us that are Americans think we're a good American, and so when we look at Captain America and like something about him, our view, if that gets challenged, it's not just, is Captain America the way I want him to be? It's also says something about my social identity. It also says something about my view of Americanhood. I mean, these are big, weighty things that are being called into question, which is why I think people get a lot more anxious over Captain America than say Spider-Man, who, just all that extra layering of culture and patriotism on there. That particular scene and that speech, which I kind of agree with you, what it does is it makes it hard to think, man, this guy must have never, how could this guy have been in the military? How could he ever been a soldier and think this? Like, there's no way I can square that, except I can, okay, fine. I follow him through the 80s. I get to the point where he turns in the shield because he doesn't trust the government. Like, I'm no longer going to be a soldier. I'm going to be something else. But that's a little bit of Captain America's uncomfortableness, which is that he's a symbol for the nation, but he isn't going to follow the command structure, and yet he's going to have an authority over it. And it's a very uncomfortable. It doesn't make any sense if you think about it too long. Mm-hmm. That scene, though, is something I almost want to say the justification for that scene is that's what a kind of libertarian bent leader of a resistance against the government has to say. That's what he has to say. That, like, he mm-hmm. has to be I get moral authority out of being right when the structure and society and everybody is wrong, because, that's like the perfect embodiment. And that's why that's such a popular quote. And people have that on, post that on social media, and they awkwardly worked it into the film, and, all of those pieces. But you're not wrong. It really does, in a sense, violate his history and his kind of placement as having been a part of a structure that believes if America's good and the military is good, then I do what I'm told. And I trust it, to get to this moment where he is saying what Mark Twain said, which was the opposite of that. Civil War is a very, Captain America isn't acting like Captain America. Tony Stark is not acting like Tony Stark. They're kind of avatars that are put into this cultural conflict in order, to embody the, neoliberal fascist state and, approach to security and, the kind of libertarian resistance to that. And all of these characters get bent out of shape, trying to get these statements made. So in one sense, I'm saying I do agree with you. I like that statement as a representation of that moment. I would have more problem with Captain America saying that today than I did in 2006 when they fed him that. But that's only because I'm looking at how this character keeps getting made and unmade. That was the Captain America that Civil War narrative needed to make sense, even though Civil War, which is great in terms of its allegory, is a little bit nonsense if you look at it too close, sure. What it does with characters. Now, Spider-Man in that narrative is kind of the avatar of the American people. Like, I mean, literally, I always think of that issue where you have Spider-Man and everybody's grabbing his arms and legs and pulling him. And I'm like, he's supposed to be the metaphor of this is the American people. They're pulled toward security early because what Tony Stark tells me about who I should be, all of that is so reinforcing. It makes me feel safe. I get to be the better version of Spider-Man with my Iron Spider suit and all of this stuff. And then I see the consequences, for other people. And Captain America gives a big speech, and all of a sudden that speech is also the turning point for, Spider-Man. He sure. comes to that group, bloodied and broken, but that speech is, basically the kind of Peter Parker sitting down and saying, Cap, tell me a story, tell me why this is okay, because it doesn't feel okay either. And then he gets this speech. And then I think what wasn't his comment after that, can I carry your lunchbox? It was like this big, kind of transition moment. So I liked that quote and that moment, but it's because they were that moment. Otherwise, leave that moment, and I'm right there with you. It's a very uncap-like thing to say.
It's interesting too, because I'd never really thought of it the way you said that Peter Parker was more like the American people, right? I like that because I always thought of him more as looking as Cap as a father figure, right? Because he looked at Tony as a father figure, but at that moment, and especially the way the artist Ron Garney drew him, there's Cap standing at the high and Peter Parker down low looking up at him.
Yeah.
You know, it was kind of more like that father figure. But I like your analogy there about American people. And Bob, we're going to save this so that the next time this comes up in the Facebook group, I can quote and say, quote, Dr. Stevens said, I wasn't wrong. Quote, no, you're not wrong.
Well, and I know he's in the group. So
and let me give you a piece on that. So for all of the great power that comes out of that quote, right? Go to the end of Civil War. Right? What happens, you know, Captain America is sitting on Iron Man's chest about to kill him. And then he's tackled by this perfect complement of first responders, right? You've got a policeman and an EMT and a firefighter. Like, they tackle him and they shock him into looking around at all the damage the superheroes are doing. And that's when he starts crying, takes off his mask, turns himself in. That's the anti Mark Twain moment. Mm-hmm. That is I said that, but I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm surrendering. So if you think of it that way, that's not the culmination of who Captain America is. It's a moment. And you know, we all add head canon to these stories. And in my head canon, a little bit's in there. This is a very frustrated Captain America. Like, he feels like he's in a corner. He doesn't know who he can trust. He's working with supervillains. There was the whole thing with the Punisher, which I thought was hilarious, but also great. You know, he brings supervillains to the table and the Punisher shoots them all. And then he gets really angry, you know, and starts beating up the Punisher. But the Punisher is also like, because the Punisher has that one moment where he's like, what? Like, you know, what was I supposed to do? It's supervillains, right? And but it's like, Cap is not Cap. He is so far from his own moral center that he's doing things that are very unlike him. And I do think it's that end of Civil War that snaps him back and makes him realize he had gone too far. He was too excessive. He had to surrender. And then, of course, they assassinated him and started all over. So, you know, but so there, you're not wrong. It's a very uncap-like thing. But in the narrative, you can also say he was pushed to say that very powerful thing. And I think he recants it when he turns himself in. I mean, that's a way to read it.
You know what? I will take the quote, you're not wrong.
Rick, you know, listeners can't see right now, but Rick Verbanis is glowing.
Okay.
He's got a glow about him.
He didn't say I was right, but Darty didn't say, he said you're not wrong. I'll take it.
But I'll say the other part is, we're all desperately looking into these moments and projecting things into them because of what our view of who these characters are supposed to be. And frankly, our orientation at 9/11, our orientation to the security state, all of those things come to play. And even when a character that we really like says something that we don't like, we don't feel comfortable with it. And that's very normal. And frankly, that's why I say Civil War, as awkward as it is in butchering certain characters who are very out of character temporarily, it made people talk. It made them, you know, think. And, you know, like I pointed out, when Captain America was assassinated, if you looked at the New York Times comment field, it was fantastically divided. You had, you know, Captain America's on the front page of the New York Times on the web, and all the comments are, you know, conservative people saying, of course, this progressive company kills a patriot during a time of war. That's what liberals do, right? They always sell out America. But then you've got liberals saying, this is what happens when George Bush is president, right? I mean, it's like everybody's projecting their own stuff into these moments, trying to orient themselves into their reactions. And so, of course, we're going to argue and fight about it. This is big stuff.
It's almost like, you know, any day of the week here now.
Right. Right. No, we are definitely in a special argumentative era. So, yeah.
All right. So we talked a little bit about Sam Wilson. So we talked about, you know, how there are different retcons that were going on with the character. And so you talk in your book about Sam Wilson and how there was this marginalization of him. You know, of course, you know, in the 70s, as you mentioned, right, there's, you know, he's in the heyday, and and then in the 80s, not so much.
Right.
So with what's been going on recently, are you surprised about how popular Sam has become in the comics and in, the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Because obviously, there's been a lot going on with the Disney Plus series and so on.
Sure. Some of my answers are never going to be as clean as you want them to be. So part of me wants to say yes, but my surprise is that was a Herculean lift to get that to happen. And I never thought it would. But then there's another part of me that is no, because they did that lift. They really did some work. So let me say a few things about what we're talking about. I mean, you've illustrated his history. This idea that the first African-American superhero who had so much goodwill coming his way gets retconned into, this street thug that was a Red Skull plant to betray Captain America. I mean, you saw in the letter columns, people just like, I cannot believe you did that. Like, how did you take this good moment and turn it into an even worse stereotype? That had existed before, that the only way an African-American can be a superhero is if the Red Skull wants to trick Captain America and makes him want to believe that this is possible. But of course it's not, because Black people can't do that. I mean, it's just such a terrible set of messages. And then you see Sam Wilson bubble up over and over, but they can't, they just tried really hard to make him work. The key to making Sam Wilson work, I think, really is the Ultimates, because the version that we see in the MCU bears much more of a resemblance to the Ultimate version, who was a veteran, who was a secret agent, who had military training and prowess and all of that. It kind of sidesteps the whole social worker, snap persona equation altogether. But that's something else I'd said in the book, is that the Ultimates for a lot of these characters was working out mostly aesthetics and trying to orient towards what would this look like on the screen. But I think for the Sam Wilson character, it reinvented a completely different backstory and set of relationships that the screen just aped off of, and therefore they did that with a few other characters, but that one in particular is great. And that configuration was great, and it let Sam Wilson be free of all of that controversy. And then after that, I'm like, well, that's why the character was popular in the first place. It is a great character. I mean, it really, he was. And so I'm really glad they managed to do that. The MCU has been a minefield of how do we bring the Wasp to the screen when everybody's going to start talking about domestic violence the moment we do? How do we bring Carol Danvers to the screen when people are going to talk about rape and alcoholism as soon as we do? How do we bring, and it sadly is most of the minority and female characters, like every Marvel character has a flaw, but the minority and female characters get these really terrible flaws that are just terrible to deal with. And I think those, House of M, Ultimates, those kind of alternate storytelling attempts really massaged a lot of those characters. So I'm really glad they did that. Once you free Sam Wilson of all that, make him a veteran, bring him into, a Captain America space as more of an equal than Snap had been, that's where he gets to shine. And so let me say I'm pleasantly surprised that happened, and really, really grateful that they did that work. Because if you told me 20 years ago that the Falcon was going to be Captain America, was like, he was, but nobody cared. And it's, not but
right.
Yeah.
We're wrapping down, but I got to ask you this question. And I don't know, have you been following any of the new sort of storylines that are coming out? And so, you talk about in the book, and we've talked about tonight, how there seems to be certain times when Cap's characterization really comes under scrutiny. And I think you argue that it generally tends to be when America's cultural values are under scrutiny, right? And there's some tension there. And so, I know there's this new series. We reviewed issue 1 just recently, the United States of Captain America.
Yeah.
And there was this, once again, a sort of a debate, in the media over whether Cap believes in the American dream or not, right? And so it's like nothing new is actually new. Everything that was old is new again, sort of thing, right? And so, I'd be curious your thoughts on this controversy again, and why we keep returning to this, and what would your book have to say about it?
Yeah. So if I were writing today and thinking about the controversy, and I do study fan culture, I'm always interested in how fans talk. That's a really important interest of mine. I've been, I guess I shouldn't be at this time, but at this point, but I am surprised how many times Captain America's monologues or internal thinking becomes the debate. Like, this guy never gets to think about things. I mean, there's kind of a funny, moment about that, where this isn't like him addressing Congress. This is him thinking about his own place and coming up with these ideals. And I get why, it's polarizing and frustrating for people. But in a sense, when I read some of those thoughts in that book, and keeping in mind this whole series is Captain America on another motorcycle journey. He is literally doing the thing where he is growing and learning and finding new experiences. So where he starts is not going to be where he ends. That is the whole point of the motorcycle journey, right? So He's starting in a dark place, but his dark place is, I think, I don't know, I've read it as he's got a lot of Lincoln in him, where he's like, we need to be better. It's like we say this, we need to improve, we're always trying to be better. But he just says it in his very dejected, dark place. I mean, where he's coming from, right? Out of the previous run, he's struggling with these kinds of questions. But I also think, having read his journey in the 70s, how does a character who stands in the middle of the Harlem race riots, how does he react to 2021 when he's watching some of this happen? In a very real sense, I'm kind of amazed at this point that, Captain America is not in therapy all the time, just over the lack of social progress, in some ways, only because he has asked these questions decades ago. And I can't imagine what that weight is on him. So I look at those moments personally, and I see him thinking about it. Obviously, the writers have certain considerations they're trying to put in his mouth to speak into this moment. And I'm, never ignorant of that. But watching people react to it, I just see it as him always in the same struggle which is he has this belief in this dream. He sees the reality. As a man at a time, he's always disappointed with the modern because it doesn't live up to what he thinks it should be. And that sometimes leads him to be very harsh in what he's seeing. But I also think that's part of this discovery of finding, I don't know, I feel like he's dejected and he's encountering other Captains America. And each one is like, gotta be for him. They haven't really articulated this, but it's gotta be towards the end of this book, like, wow, other people believe in the dream and are living out these situations that I, at the beginning of this series, say is horrible, but I'm watching people make it work, and watching them grab onto these ideals and to make their communities and other people's lives better. How is that not the best expression of the dream? And I don't know where the series is going, but I really hope that's the trajectory, is that these other characters that he's running into are cheering him up, or giving him something to believe in again, which is what he is doing, inspiring everybody. Who inspires Captain America? Captains America, right? And so I personally didn't react as strongly as I saw other people, but it was fascinating to watch them do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we love having the conversation with people in the Facebook group, because there's so many different opinions on it. But I love your take in the fact that Cap's starting at a dark place. And to your point, as any of these stories have gone, where he's been on a motorcycle and traveled across the country, right, where he ends up is not where he starts. And the fact that he needs to be cheered up, because after decades of seeing something that, who else is going to be, I mean, it could weigh on someone, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think you're right. That's where he's at in this point. So,
almost like, sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, I always think of like certain symbols, like the shield means certain things, and we have all this stuff wrapped in. The motorcycle, it's like the motorcycle is Cap's thinking machine. I mean, it just is like he's on the motorcycle. He's going to think about some things, on that quiet, although it always cracks me up in those stories when he's riding along talking to somebody, and I'm like, I've never seen some people on a motorcycle just talk to each other while they're riding. But apparently that's his superpower, right? Is to also have cultural conversation on this thinking machine that he's on.
Right.
Yes, and he has a super bike that's ultra quiet.
Right.
Well, so tell us, Rick, what's next for you? What else do you have on the horizon?
Oh, well, and so I study lots of things related to fan culture. I have a book I've been writing for a while that's looking at Hasbro, and particularly the Hasbro Marvel FCC Sunbow connection in the 80s that led to a lot of the hyper commercialism around toy culture, and and of course Secret Wars is a part of that, as his superpowers and all of that. But I've just been really interested in that moment of deregulation when suddenly we saw this explosion of culture, and and how that kind of imprinted. So that's kind of a long project. I've been asked to write a Captain Marvel book, and because I can't say no to great opportunities, I'm starting that, but I can't promise when that's going to get done, because that keeps growing on me. I mean, that's
right. Yeah.
That's a character who both has this history that's not quite as long as Cap's, but she's been through more changes than he has. Really, when you start looking at all the different eras and all the different moves, and I'm interested in those things. And then, of course, I'm also writing articles. I just published a book chapter on Superman smashes the Klan, and that graphic novel take on the 1946 radio series. There's stuff I see happen, and I'm really interested in adaptation when people are changing media with a property and how they have to change the character to make that work. And then, of course, the fan reactions to that is just a goldmine for me. Watching how, because what people are really arguing about in those moments, whether it be Snake Eyes and the way they don't like the way he looks, or He-Man this last week has been really interesting to watch, or all of that, they're arguing about their own social identity and what they've connected and invested in these properties, and why they want culture to work certain ways, what it says about them, in other words, what their tastes are. And so I'm just really interested in projects like that. But right now I've got 2 books going that won't be finished this year. So
okay, well, the Hasbro one will be out sooner. Do you have a working title?
Transforming Culture. Is the short title, and then the longer one, of course, it's mostly about G.I. Joe and Transformers. It's
it's a nice play on word. Yeah,
I know, I like that. That's good.
I do. It's a good working title.
I got that reference.
Yeah,
thank you.
I got that
Cap line.
When you told me about the Captain Marvel book and the different iterations that she's gone through, I tried to come up with some sort of play on words with binary, but I couldn't come up with anything. It was too duplicative.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Rick's getting punch drunk. So
I had a fun punny moment when one of my non-binary friends was struggling over that new Walgreens exclusive figure, saying this is the one figure I can't buy because I'm not binary. He was, being punny. And I was like, does it help you to know that was just a phase, right? I mean, that was her binary phase, and she moved past it. But no, I find that character fascinating in different ways than Captain America, only because the idea that Marvel Comics, just like they were doing with, hey, kung fu movies are in, so let's make some kung fu heroes. They said, hey, Gloria Steinem and Wonder Woman, that was a thing. Let's make a feminist book. And it was so awkwardly done in the beginning. And every time the mostly male Marvel writers put their hands on it, with the exception of Chris Claremont, really bad things have happened to that character and for that character. And then you have Chris Claremont constantly stepping in and yelling at people to leave his character alone, and and grabbing her. But I find all of that fascinating. What does it mean when certain people get to decide what they think a gender looks like, and how a lot of other people say, no, that's not good. But same thing with Captain America. What does patriotism look like? What does masculinity look like? What, how should good Americans act? And then the next writer does something different. That's a paradox. And I'm just constantly fascinated with the way that mechanism works in our cultural system.
Well, can't wait to hear your take on Avengers 200.
I have a take if you want to hear it, but we can save that for another time.
We'll definitely do that another time. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for coming on. I highly recommend to all of our listeners to check out his book, Captain America: Masculinity and Violence. It's a great read, and certainly we touched a little bit on it here, but thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having you.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Okay, well, that was a great conversation with Dr. Stevens, and we're very appreciative to have him on the show. Had a good time talking with him.
Yeah, I mean, Rick, I know this is a lot of this is can be a little bit cerebral, right? A little bit academic, but I mean, I think this is fascinating, right? This sort of intersection between just the comic book and sort of the deeper meanings of popular culture and what popular culture says about society and culture and values and morality. I mean, to me, this is great stuff. So I hope the listeners enjoyed the interview and got some ideas out of it, maybe thought a little bit, or prompted to think some more about this after. And would love to hear some feedback on what you thought about it.
Yeah, I think our listeners can handle the cerebral. I think our listeners certainly appreciate the sometimes philosophical discussions that we have, Bob.
Yeah, well, I'm sure. Yeah.
So coming up next episode, which is going to be episode 48, we're going to get into a top 10 list. We haven't done a top 10 list in, man, we're talking 8 months since we've done a top 10 list.
Yeah, seems like it.
Yeah. And so, Bob, it's going to be an idea you came up with, which I love. And that is the top 10 origin differences of Captain America, right? Because as we talked a little bit with Dr. Stevens about retcons and how that has happened over the years, right? This, the Cap's origin has changed a little subtly here and subtly there over his 80-year history. So we're going to be talking about our favorite top 10 origin differences.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one, Rick, because there's a lot of the differences that I think are obvious, but some are not so obvious, right? Some are a little more nuanced, maybe, or a little less superficial. And I think it's going to be really fun to sort of dig into those a little bit and compare and contrast them against across a lot of different origin stories. And I think some folks might be surprised how many different times Cap's origin story has been told.
Yeah. And I'm going to be surprised a little bit too on some of those subtle things, right? Because I know some of the larger ones, maybe it's like, oh, well, was it the Vita rays? Was it the secret soldier or super soldier serum? Look at, I'm already getting that messed up. You know, I mean, like those are the more obvious ones, but I know there's going to be a lot of subtle ones too. So that'll be fun. And then Bob, I don't know if you've been paying attention, you know, but that next episode is 48. You know, what's creeping up is 50.
Yeah. I know.
We got
50,
episode 50 coming up.
50 does creep up on you.
That's right, doesn't it? So we're going to do an anniversary show. I haven't really figured it out yet. But it's going to be kind of like highlights, I think. Some fun moments.
Yeah.
So, yeah, well, that's creeping up on us. Wow. All right, Bob. Well, as always, it's been fun wrapping cap with you.
Indeed. Let's do this again real soon, Rick.
All right. He's Bob Lucius. I'm Rick Verbanis, and you've been listening to another episode of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast.